Story 1 and 2. In 1986, a widowed father named Frank Myers relocated with his 2 daughters to a historic colonial home in a quiet Massachusetts town called Harrows Bay. His older daughter, Leah, was 16, and her younger sister, Maddie, was just 9, still grieving the loss of their mother. The family hoped that change of scenery would help them heal. But strange things began happening almost immediately. It started with little things, odd knocking in the walls, lights flickering, furniture slightly shifted. They chalked it up to the quirks of an aging house. That is, until Leah and Maddie bored one weekend, played with a Ouija board. At first, they laughed until the board responded. A second later, they heard 3 sharp knocks coming from inside the wall behind them. From there, things spiraled. The family's belongings began vanishing. The TV would switch on in the dead of night, and Frank constantly felt like someone was watching him. One night, Frank came home to complete disorder. The house was freezing despite the heater blasting. Radios played static. Stairs, he found something horrifying. A teenage boy in a tattered wedding dress and smeared makeup stood silently in the hallway, holding a hatchet. The intruder's name was Daniel Kane. He had broken into the house months earlier. Obsessed with Leah, he had carved peepholes in the walls and created makeshift tunnels to move unnoticed. He had been living inside their walls the entire time, watching them. The family escaped and called the police. When officers arrived, they found Daniel crouched inside a wall cavity, surrounded by food wrappers, blankets, and tools. He was arrested, but released on bail. Weeks later, he broke into another home and murdered a woman and her 2 children. He is now serving life in prison. The Myers family never returned to that house. Story 3. Ashley Reynolds lived alone in a small, cozy 1-bedroom rental just outside of Spokane, Washington. She had recently moved in during the winter, drawn to the charm of the quiet neighborhood and the peacefulness of the wooded area behind the house. Her friends warned her about living alone near the forest, but Ashley valued her privacy. At first, everything seemed normal. She spent her days working remotely as a freelance designer, enjoying the calm. But then, late one night, while watching TV in bed, she began hearing faint tapping sounds coming from within the walls, not scratching like mice. This was slower, more deliberate, almost like knuckles rapping gently on wood. She dismissed it at first, probably just old pipes or settling wood. But the sounds only came after midnight, often just moments after she turned off the television. A few days later, she heard a new sound, a dragging or scraping noise from the air vent above her bed. It lasted just a second. She stood on a chair and pointed her flashlight into the vent. Nothing. Darkness. Roughly 3 weeks after the strange noises began, she awoke one morning to find her back door wide open. No broken locks, nothing missing. Just open, like someone had left in a hurry. Ashley called the police. They inspected the home but found no signs of forced entry. They suggested the lock might have malfunctioned. Still uneasy, she changed every lock in the house that day. That night, the noises returned, but now it was something new. She heard soft footsteps above her head. Not from the roof, but from within the crawl space between the ceiling and attic. She froze. As soon as she reached for her phone, the sound stopped. The next morning, unable to rest, she opened the attic hatch. Most of the space was just insulation, dust, and old boards. But in a far corner, she saw something that didn't belong. A crumpled plastic water bottle, a torn granola wrapper, and a rolled-up sleeping bag. Someone had been living above her. She fled the house and called the police again. This time, officers conducted a thorough sweep. They discovered a hidden tunnel carved behind the closet in her bedroom, accessed through a loose panel behind the furnace. Inside, a man was hiding. He had been camping in a narrow wall cavity for weeks, maybe longer. He had bags of snacks, old clothes, and had even cut a hole in the drywall behind a vent so he could watch her while she slept. Asterisk, he didn't have ID. He didn't resist. He was likely a homeless drifter who had been squatting in the crawlspace before Ashley even moved in. Asterisk, Ashley never returned. She moved out within days. The landlord patched the drywall and resealed the crawlspace, but neighbors say no tenant has stayed long since. One couple reportedly moved in months later and left within 3 weeks. No one knows exactly why. Asterisk, sometimes the scariest part of a house isn't what's outside. It's what might be living just inches away in the silence behind your walls. Story for Asterisk. In 1941, in Denver, Colorado, an elderly man named Howard Ellsworth lived a quiet life alone in his Victorian-style home. He had worked for the railroads and was known by his neighbors for his punctual routines and old-fashioned manner. His wife had been hospitalized for a long illness, leaving Howard by himself. Asterisk, unbeknownst to him, an old acquaintance named Thomas Grand, a sickly, penniless man, had returned to town. Desperate and homeless, Thomas broke into Howard's house one day while it was empty. In the attic, he found a cramped storage crawlspace, barely large enough to squeeze into, and that's where he decided to stay. For weeks, Thomas lived silently, above Howard's head, sneaking down only when he was out to steal food, newspapers, and water. The creaks in the floorboards and whispers of movement were so subtle that Howard chalked them up to the groans of the aging house. Asterisk, but one night, everything changed. Howard came home early and heard a faint noise from the upper floor. Investigating, he caught Thomas emerging from the attic. Startled and afraid of being discovered, Thomas struck Howard with a heavy iron rod from an old stove. The blows were fatal. Howard died at the foot of the stairs. Asterisk, when police arrived, the scene made no sense. Doors were locked from the inside. Nothing was stolen. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Locals began calling it the ghost house murder, but the killer never left. Asterisk Thomas continued living in the attic, right above the crime scene. He came out only at night, still stealing food, pacing quietly, and staring through the vents into the lifeless house. He stayed there for nearly 6 weeks until a neighbor reported seeing movement in the supposedly abandoned home. Asterisk, when officers returned and investigated the attic, they found Thomas curled in a dark crawlspace, skeletal, filthy, and mumbling nonsense. He confessed immediately. The press later dubbed him the Denver wall crawler. He was sentenced to life in prison. The house was abandoned and never lived in again. Story 5. In 2012, single mother in South Carolina lived with her 5 children. In a modest home she had been renting after leaving a long and abusive relationship. Her ex had a troubling past, multiple arrests, and a reputation for being unpredictable. But she thought she had finally moved on. Then, strange things started happening. Food began to disappear. Light switches would be flipped, and worst of all, at night she'd hear faint noises from the ceiling, whispers, scuttling, and low thumps. One night, while lying in bed, she noticed something horrifying. The nails in her ceiling were pushing downward, one by one, as if someone was trying to pry their way through from above. She tried to rationalize it, maybe stress, maybe animals, but the disturbances escalated. Small objects were moved. Insulation began falling from vents, feeling unsafe. She asked her nephew to check the attic. What he found was chilling. Her ex-boyfriend had been secretly living up there. He had created a tiny hideout next to the heating unit, lined with blankets, old coats, and food wrappers. He had even carved small holes in the ceiling so he could spy on her and the children. Asterisk, when police arrived, they discovered he had been living in the attic for nearly 2 weeks, coming down only when no one was home. He had a key from their time, together and had let himself in after she'd changed the locks. He was arrested, but the trauma lingered. The woman and her children moved shortly after, unable to sleep, knowing someone had been living inches above them, watching in silence. Asterisk story. 7 asterisk Lisa Marlowe had just started over. After a long relationship ended, she bought a modest fixer-upper on the edge of Portland, Oregon. It was an older house from the 1950s, creaky, drafty, but charming in its way. It was just her and her dog, and at first, the peace and quiet felt like healing. Asterisk, but a couple of months in, Lisa began to notice something strange. Asterisk, at night, as she lay in bed, she would hear a faint sound, soft, labored breathing, coming from the wall just beside her headboard. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Slow, shallow exhalations, like someone with a chest cold breathing through their nose. Asterisk, she moved furniture, checked for vents, even listened to the drywall. Nothing made sense. Then came to tapping, rhythmic, deliberate, like fingers on wood. And once, she swore she heard a whisper. It was so quiet, she couldn't make out the words, but it was coming from inside the wall. Asterisk, terrified, Lisa began sleeping on the couch. She told a friend, who joked that maybe her house was haunted, but Lisa wasn't so sure. The sounds were too real, too human. Asterisk, finally, after a week of avoiding the room, she decided to confront whatever it was. She took a crowbar to a small, square panel low on the wall, something she had previously assumed was an old utility hatch. The screws came out with almost no effort. Behind it was a dark cavity. She shone her phone flashlight inside. Asterisk, what she saw froze her in place. The wall wasn't hollow. It led to a narrow crawlspace, maybe 3 feet wide, running deep into the structure. In the back corner of that space, a man was crouched, knees to his chest, skin pale, eyes wide and fixed directly on her. Asterisk, he didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared. Asterisk, Lisa screamed and ran. The man never emerged, but when police arrived, they found clear signs he had been living inside the walls for weeks. There were bottles filled with waste, food wrappers, and a sleeping bag. The most disturbing discovery was the drawings, hundreds of them, scratched into the insulation and wood. Almost all of them were of Lisa. Asterisk, they later determined the man had gained entry through an old utility hatch in the basement that led up behind the bedroom walls. From there, he'd been listening and likely watching her. Asterisk, through hairline cracks or old grates as she slept. Asterisk, the man was never found. Police believe he had no connection to Lisa and likely chose the house at random. He had simply stayed hidden, moving only when she wasn't home, surviving in the shadows. Asterisk, Lisa moved out the next day and has never lived alone since.